In this lecture, we look at identity politics, the inheritance of the late 1960s, and the Great Awakening, or the alliance between neoliberal oligarchs and the identity politics priesthood that had formed in the universities. Identity politics is the idea that individuals need to be understood as inextricably linked to certain groups in society. Rather than being understood as common citizens, they're to be understood as subjects who are going to receive rights, privileges, and duties based on these overlapping identities assigned by an elite class. The 1990s introduced something called the culture wars. Probably the greatest impetus of this was an article by Time magazine that described the results of the 1990 census. It had reported, quote, "Someday soon, white Americans will become a minority group. The presupposition that the typical U.S. citizen is someone who traces his or her descent in a direct line to Europe will be part of the past." And so this introduced a new question in education. Should students in this new pluralist society, should they learn about their own identity groups and their own unique contributions to American history? Conservatives responded by saying no, they ought to learn about a noble American history where all are equal citizens. In these multiculturalist disputes, centrist liberals, including Gary Nash, who had introduced in part ethnic education, ethnic studies into American history, they were questioned by those on the left, and those who tried to uphold assimilation were branded as racist, even those who wanted to discuss other ethnic groups. And so we find that some of the greatest critics of neoliberals are those on the left. Here you see in American academia the rise of a new progressive movement. Some of its leading thinkers were those like Cornel West and Roberto Unger, who talked about emphasizing race, that race matters. And so those on the left criticized neoliberals like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's welfare reform, it was argued, had channeled single mothers away from school to low-paying jobs. Angela Davis, who was still around as she'd been since the 1960s, she fought what she called systemic racism. Black incarceration rates were a form of white supremacy, and blacks in the U.S. prison system were not just part of a private system, they were actually political prisoners in prison for their race. She also blamed the low graduation rates on white supremacy, as well as the policies introduced by neoliberals in the major cities. Coming from that old case, Terry v. Ohio, the practice of stop and frisk was introduced into New York and was credited for lowering crime rates in that city. From the left, thinkers like Noam Chomsky argued there should be an end to neoliberal Western colonialism. Noam Chomsky argued that international institutions privileged and benefited the United States in its world hegemony, instead of introducing a globalist regime in which countries would be represented equally. At universities all across America, globalism became a field of study and inquiry. Globalism became an orthodoxy. Universities would advertise courses that would teach their students to become global citizens. The leftists argued that neoliberal institutions could be reformed for more globalist ends. They argued for the creation of a true international law that would benefit all global citizens. They argued that the WTO, or the United Nations, the first introduced for free trade policies, and the second as a forum for nations to engage in disputes, that both of these could be reformed to be far more democratic. The WTO, instead of looking simply at free trade, could be used as a mechanism to introduce fair trade reforms or environmental reforms, reforms that would protect endangered species and the like. The UN, argued Peter Singer, ought to be used to introduce democracy to the globe. Rather, nations should be represented by proportion, by population, that there should be a dismantling of the Security Council that privileged Western nations that had nuclear arms. And so in universities in the 1990s, the academics there, and they began to debate one another, each of these fields, whether it's African American studies or women's studies, became whole systems that used their own jargon to challenge some of their basic tenets was tantamount to heresy. And what they took aim at was Rawlsian neoliberalism, or neoliberalism in general. And they argued that Rawlsian liberalism itself was to blame for inequities in American society and in global society. And so borrowing from critical theory and thinkers like Herbert Marcuse, academics like Iris Marion Young in her book, Justice and the Politics of Difference, criticized neoliberalism beginning with its logic. All Western logic, they argued, was moved by the search for absolute essences and identities. Western logic searches for the absolute same, which logically requires a referent other. And so Western logic thinks in terms of binaries, where those on the left argued the same in Western logic really meant whiteness. And so under the cover of universals, whiteness was able to pose as universal humanity and impartiality in ethics and in morals. For example, neoliberals, who really were an extension of the Western tradition, would talk about meritocracy, or they would talk about universal human values. But really, these were just white, heterosexual Christian values to which all others were forced to conform and to assimilate. The idea of Western logic inexorably led to colonialism and exploiting race and gender groups across the globe, particularly the global South, or those minorities who lived in the United States. In psychology, progressives championed authenticity, not homo economicus, the way the liberals had discussed human beings. The neoliberals had talked about a rejection of the good, but rather, argued the left, they had sneaked in their own idea of the good and how human beings should live. Those in identity politics argued for a self-exploration, to go through one's experiences and to see the presuppositions and the presumptions that one carried with them as they experienced the world that literally shaped their experiences. Insofar as they were members of a particular group, particularly whites, then they could understand that they shared in the guilt of the group and that they had to identify with that group and be directed to proper forms of atonement. And so what was key in the 1990s, it had never really left, was the idea of consciousness raising. And so words like woke are revived. The idea of becoming woke to one's identity and the systems that lie behind the phenomena. And those systems would inform us as to what our privileges were. We could recognize what those privileges are and then confess white privilege and then be directed to different forms of penance and behavioral change. Whites could then be allies in the fight against anti-racism. Those professing no religious preference increased in the 1990s, and that correlated to the increase in the religious teachings of social justice. As the percent of those with four-year degrees rose, 22% in 1990, 26% in 2000, 30% in 2010, 33% in 2016, so did those professing no religion. From 6.7% in 1991 to 14% in 2000 to 18% in 2010 to 22.8% in 2014. And so in these new religious teachings, one could get a sense of meaning and purpose by identifying in a certain group or unifying as allies with the other. And with the broader utopian promise of being dissolved into a global humanity and even being at one with the environment. It also meant that these religious teachings included the use of fear, not just the promise of hope in the long future, but also fear. Prophets warned about the destruction of all human life. They told young people they needed to act now to save the planet, or else they would reap the consequences of global fires and floods. These identity politics teachings and rituals became the moral gateway to the top 10% of American society. 77% of the wealthiest Americans' children go to Ivy League schools. And this, in every regime, the powerful and wealthy people send their children to the priests to be educated. And so this was a moral sniff test, an ethical sniff test to make sure that those who climbed in the highest ranks of power had the same ideas. In the identity politics conception of justice, there were several important thinkers. One, Patricia Hill Collins, argued for the matrix of domination. She said that every institution is a matrix of race, class, and gender domination inherited from slavery. What's important about this teaching is that it's not enough to simply say that one is oppressed. Rather, you need all to agree to a matrix of domination. What this means is that you need to own up to your position in a society within the matrix of domination as either oppressed or oppressor. And so there are certain obligations that you have as being part of this matrix. The attack that the leftists made on Rawls was that his veil of ignorance, or that his original position, was completely removed from empirical experience. Rather, Rawls' original position was, in the words of Charles Mills, a racial contract, or in the words of Carol Pateman, a sexual contract. It meant that Rawls' idea of the veil of ignorance itself was nothing more than a justification for introducing white supremacy. In reality, whites cannot understand what it's like to be black or to be female. And so in the veil of ignorance, they pretend as if they can understand what it's like, and so they can remove all bias from themselves, even as they go on to create a society in which they receive all of the privileges. And so, in these criticisms of the racial or the sexual contract, the argument was neoliberalism had led to the rule of an elite white caste. Rather, instead of pretending that we are ignorant of racial differences or gender differences, we should openly talk about these things. We should recognize the injustices of the past, and we should remedy them by recognizing these identity groups and by empowering them in society. In helping to fill out the systems of identity politics, there were some key thinkers. One of them was Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar. Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989, introduced another seminal teaching of identity politics, and that was intersectionality. Here she was drawing from theories of the past. We could distill this down to intersectionality in the basement. She had argued that oppressed groups could be likened to those who were in the basement of a house. So in this house, and the house is American society, there's a first floor, and that first floor is equal opportunity. Look at this in light of John Rawls' argument that you can treat groups differently insofar as they're economically disadvantaged and were born into those groups. Those who are born into oppressed groups, they are born into the basement. And there they all are together. Those who have one form of oppression, for example, born of color, right? Black males, white females, they're in the basement, but there's others in the basement who lie at the intersection of different oppressed groups. You might have a black female. You might have a lesbian white female. One of the key elements in the criticism by those in the left on identity politics of neoliberalism was the idea that there was a first floor of equal opportunity. And they criticized Rawls' idea of meritocracy. Remember, this was the second basic principle that all those in the original position would accept. It was also a basic principle for the Friedmanites, those who believed in free markets, that individuals through hard work could climb up in socioeconomic status. The argument rather here was that there was no meritocracy, that we needed to put principles of democracy first. And that would mean that all claims to meritocracy were really expressions of white supremacy. And so instead of having an open search for positions, private business as well as the government needed to represent these identity groups, even so far as including quotas. And so there was no meritocracy, properly speaking. This again was a veil of universalism that privileged one particular group. Rather, there needed to be unequal treatment under the law. Groups needed to be treated differently to correct for structural injustices. In the multiculturalist teachings of the 1990s, one of the arguments was, if you are in a minority group, particularly if you're at the intersection of groups, and you receive your meaning and identity from that group, the worst thing that can be done to you is assimilation, literally destroying the group that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. And so you find the argument by Charles Taylor and others that one of the cardinal sins against group identity is assimilation. And so it is the work of the government to promote and reinvigorate the groups that give individuals a sense of meaning and purpose. Those on the left openly embraced democratic socialism, something that had been poo-pooed since the 1960s, and with the rise of the neoliberal period, the idea is that big government didn't work. But those on the left are reviving the concept of democratic socialism, and that would come to fruit later on with candidates such as Bernie Sanders and AOC. In democratic socialism, there was a very different view as to the role of government, and again, an open attack on John Rawls. Thinkers like Susan Mahler-Oken would challenge Rawls' conception of liberalism. They argued that the notion that liberalism would be contained in public and procedural justice, they argued, only continued oppression. Rather, the function of a democratic socialist state was for government to get involved in those very areas that liberals abstained from. For example, the realm of private life, sex in the family. If there were forms of oppression that were going on in those areas, it was the work of government to root those out. Another place where we see limitations on liberalism, according to the left, is in the idea of internationalism. Rawls was an internationalist. He believed in what he called the law of peoples, or the maintaining of people's traditions. And so he had argued against international institutions that would cede too much sovereignty to international bodies. Certainly was against what Peter Singer would call globalism or one world now. But the democratic socialists were arguing we needed to transcend the nation state altogether. And so they were in favor of these global institutions that would privilege the colonized South or the global South and would be recompense for the colonialist policies of Western nations that went back 200-300 years. It also meant in the 1990s that those on the left came out in full force against free speech. They began to argue in favor of hate speech or limitations on what Americans could say. There were many hate speech codes present in American universities in the 1990s. While the Supreme Court would strike many of these down, the universities kept creating them. And so as we see, leftists and those in identity politics were the most severe critics of the neoliberal order because it privileged Americans in the world order. So how is it that large corporations who so supported neoliberalism would become so friendly to the identity politics crowd? There's a phrase called the Great Awakening that seeks to explain this. And what it means is that neoliberals would unify in opposition to the populist right on issues of trade, immigration, and war. This is best explained with the populist uprisings following the Great Recession, which began with the housing market crisis in 2008. Barack Obama was elected as centrist. Usually conservatives think of him as being a socialist, but you have to remember that the description of Barack Obama by those like Cass Sunstein was that he was a pragmatist. Obama did not talk much about race. He talked about not the red states or blue states of America, but the United States of America. Many of the whites who would vote for Donald Trump elected or voted for Barack Obama. However, in response to the Great Recession, Obama revealed that he himself was a neoliberal. We have to remember that Obama, not wanting to look squishy on issues like defense, had argued that the United States was wrong to go into Iraq. Remember, Hillary Rodham Clinton in the primary had said she just voted to support the troops, but everybody knew she was in full support of the war. Obama could honestly say that he voted against the war so that he wouldn't look weak on defense. Obama argued the United States should have invaded Afghanistan, and so began in full a full commitment to U.S. democracy building there in Afghanistan instead. When it came to the Great Recession, Obama had to make a choice. There were those that surrounded him, advisors like David Axelrod or Rahm Emanuel, his first chief of staff, who argued that what was needed was, quote, Old Testament justice. That was for the banks and the CEOs of the banks and the hedge funds and all those who had invested in subprime mortgages. However, Obama listened to the neoliberal influences in the White House, Secretary of Treasury Timothy Geithner, who was very much connected to Wall Street. And so when all of the representatives of big banks came to the White House for a meeting and they expected a lashing, instead what they found in Obama was an abetter. In response to the massive bailouts of the banks and large corporations, there were populist uprisings in the United States. From the right, the argument was all of these large institutions should be allowed to fail, that those who were neoliberals ought to apply the same free market principles that they had preached. On the populist right, new media outlets such as Breitbart News decided that they would take down neoliberals in the Republican Party that they believed had not benefited the base. Very famously, Breitbart News sensationalized the efforts of the Gang of Eight and other Republicans for another amnesty on immigration, and they attacked Eric Cantor, which had never been done before, that they primaried the House Majority Leader, and he lost. And for the first time, the populists in the Republican Party, going all the way back to what Kevin Phillips had argued about the Republican Party in 1982, and which had emerged momentarily with the 19% of Americans who voted for Ross Perot and economic nationalism in the 1990s. For the first time, the populace seemed to be taking over the Republican Party, and they challenged all of those that they called conservative Inc., who were running the party that they argued didn't have the base in mind or its interest in mind. Neoliberals like Thomas Friedman, in response to the Tea Party victory in the midterms of 2010, called the Republican Party, along with Obama, the party of no. And all of those Tea Party Republicans in the Freedom Caucus refused to work with Obama. They argued that Obama had refused to actually court them or work with them, that he had rushed through the Affordable Care Act, a very controversial, unwieldy piece of legislation that only Democrats had supported, even though it would very much change the landscape of healthcare in America. Thinkers like Thomas Friedman had argued very publicly that, with the rise of the populace in the Republican Party, nations like China were far more democratic, and we would be much better off with one-party rule that ignored the base of the Republican Party. The radicals who gathered at Occupy Wall Street were influenced by two new theories that I think would go on to become very important, particularly in the creation of BLM and Antifa and these other organizations. The first one was modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory, or MMT, was a school of thought that traces its origins to the late 1990s. Some of its key founding thinkers were L. Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell, and Warren Mosler. The basic point of modern monetary theory is that there needed to be a post-Keynesian economics, essentially there needed to be a return to big fiscal policy in Keynesian economics, which had never been truly tried. What they meant by this is that the Austrian economics, free markets, and balanced budgets had failed to take into consideration how a fiat currency worked. There was no fixed currency, they pointed out. Rather, the dollar was not fixed to the price of gold. They considered American economics really in terms of an accounting identity, considering the amount of dollars in circulation abroad in trade, the amount of dollars spent by the U.S. federal government, and the amount of dollars in circulation because of private business. The argument is while those on the right were constantly concerned with balanced budgets, and they were afraid that printing too many dollars would lead to inflation, they said that with the incredible demand for U.S. dollars from abroad, the real permanent problem was deflation. If you remember going back to those days, Glenn Beck talking about an inconvenient truth, he said, with the printing of all these dollars to bail out financial institutions and corporations, we were going to face severe inflation. But economists on the news kept talking about deflation. And the argument was that with the demand for dollars through globalization, that the constant pressure on the American economy was a shortage of currency, paper in circulation. And so deflation was the primary concern of the modern monetary theorists. A government that is a monopoly currency issuer, argued Wray and Mosler, can never go bankrupt. It can always print more money to pay off its deficits. In this new understanding of economics, the modern monetary theorists criticized the old view of the role of currency, or that which had been taught in conservative circles. In conservative circles, generally the idea is that individuals create wealth through their labor and through their ideas, and that the value of paper currency is determined by supply and demand, and individuals trade the wealth that they create with one another. This was not accurate, said Wray and Mosler. Rather, the argument was the value that was given to paper currency was determined by the government because it was able to create a demand by requiring people to pay their taxes. Probably the best example of this is the one that Mosler gives about how he could give value to a bunch of worthless business cards. He said, I've got a business card. How do I create a demand for it? He said, well, I tell you that to obtain this business card, you have to perform one of a number of chores or tasks in the room. And if you try to leave the room, there's a man with a 9mm handgun standing outside it who will shoot you. This is a very different understanding of the role of currency in a society. It's also the idea that those who were laboring were doing so they could obtain money to pay their taxes. How this played out in popular politics was MMT advocates like Bill Mitchell called conservatives who wanted to introduce austerity measures in response to the recession, quote, deficit terrorists. What was needed was not some kind of balanced budget that would reduce the amount of dollars in circulation. That would rather only continue the recession. Rather, there were only two kinds of politics in this new MMT view of currency management. The conservatives, who, given the constant demand for dollars abroad and facing constant deflationary pressures at home, the conservatives wanted to introduce more money by giving money to large corporations or by tax cuts, giving it to wealthy citizens. The problem with that is that you could give money to wealthy citizens, but they may not spend it. It may never enter into circulation. So that was the conservative politics. This was very persuasive. This seemed to explain also to conservatives why it was that those who had claimed to be conservative on fiscal policy, people like Paul Ryan and so on, had not actually balanced the budget since Bill Clinton, hadn't balanced a budget since 1997, even when the Republicans were in control of the presidency and the Congress. Liberalism, under the view of MMT, would return to big fiscal policy. That meant that the government would undertake a host of spending measures given directly to the people, and so it would directly enter into circulation and thereby relieve the deflationary pressures caused by the demand for dollars abroad. You have to understand those who are elected to Congress don't understand economics, but they do understand some basics. And one of the problems George W. Bush faced after the dot-com bubble is that even though interest rates were set at almost zero, the economy didn't seem to be picking up. And so Andy Card, the chief of staff, called in Warren Mosler to explain the new economics to the Bush administration. And so Warren Mosler explained that balanced budgets were fine if the economy was booming. But if the economy was in recession, what was needed under the principles of MMT was a return to big fiscal policy. And so he advised to Bush another large tax cut on top of increase in federal spending in the Medicare Part D program. A second theory that influenced Occupy Wall Street was a new theory of revolutionary violence. There were thinkers like Slavoj Žižek or Alain Badiou, who argued that the problem of the left was it was too influenced by liberalism, and particularly neoliberalism. Rather, they argued that the left, in order to be successful, had to shake off its fear of terrorism and violence. Žižek even appealed to Robespierre. He argued that the problem of liberalism was it wanted to distinguish humanism and rights from terrorism, whereas Robespierre had properly connected the two. He argued that those on the left, if they understand themselves properly historically, that they didn't need to worry about the limitations of the old communist theory, calling himself a communist, although not a Stalinist, not advocating the old Marxist-Leninist regime. Rather, that those on the left would need to understand they needed to leap into a revolutionary abyss so that they could help direct the future of humanity. What revolutionaries and what protesters often did to limit themselves is they waited for a justification of, quote, the big other. It means that before they engaged in revolutionary violence, they waited for somebody from the state or some authority to tell them, oh, okay, now it's time to commit violence. And he says that's the problem. Rather, the only person who can make that decision is the individual himself. And there needed to be a kind of courage on the left to leap into revolutionary violence and be willing to engage in acts of terror. And only by that way would they further the causes of the left. Žižek particularly focused on environmentalism, that if there was really going to be a change that would stave off climate change, that those on the left would have to be willing to commit acts of revolutionary terror and violence so that they could push back on the fossil fuel industries. And so leftists had been the greatest critics of neoliberalism. From academia, they had pontificated on the hypocrisy of the internationalists. But the leftists could also justify globalization if they could just use those institutions for good. And so in what's called the Great Awakening, the neoliberal oligarchs are faced with a choice. Looking at the populist revolt on both the right and the left, and on the conservative side, realizing that all of their justifications were gone. They had no legitimacy of those primary conservative schools of thought. The neoliberal oligarchs are going to side against the economic nationalist as the populist base in the Republican Party, and they're going to side with identity politics. From the vantage point of the neoliberal oligarchs, there was no going back to an industrial economy. Those jobs aren't coming back, they argued. Nor could you put political power into the hands of those who didn't properly understand the American economy and the global economy and how it worked. And so the only choice was to side with the identity politics priesthood. And that was an easy choice to make. The idea came from watching what had happened in these leftist popular protests going all the way back to 1999 in Seattle. It was at that protest against the WTO where we first see the emergence of the progressive stack. And what this means is that those who championed identity politics for minorities and for women attacked those who were protesting the WTO for prioritizing white males and giving them a voice. This took root in Occupy Wall Street. And in this progressive revolutionary stack, white males who already are born into privilege would have to defer to those who were oppressed and allow them to vent or to stack first. Large corporations saw this and they realized they could easily buy off leaders in identity politics. They donated large amounts of money to social justice campaigns, Black Lives Matter, and other groups. And so oligarchs saw that they could divert populism by appealing to race and gender identity. And so in what's called the Great Awakening, neoliberals and the oligarchs would take a hard turn left in supporting and sponsoring identity politics. The New York Times reference to leftist terms tripled from 2011 to 2015. Some of these words were patriarchy, mansplaining, toxic masculinity, whiteness, non-binary, and racism. Obama, being frustrated with the Tea Party, which he called the party of no, had had enough. And so Obama himself took a radical turn left in sponsoring the gender and race identity politics. Obama switched. He said he'd evolved in his views of marriage to now support gay marriage, women in combat, and trans rights under Title VII. In 2015, the Supreme Court in the Obergefell ruling argued that same-sex marriage was a constitutional right. What's interesting is this was not democratic. Of all states, one of the most liberal, California, in Prop 8, had actually voted in a popular vote to bar same-sex marriage in the California Constitution. This simply wasn't defended by the California Attorney General. The EEOC, following the ruling, extended gender identity and the concept of gender identity. In 2016, the Department of Education and the Department of Justice sent the first, quote, Dear Colleague letter to schools. And what that said is that schools needed to respect trans identity. There was a famous case in northern Illinois where a public school would have to allow males who considered themselves females to shower with females. And the threat was they would revoke federal funding from the school unless they complied. Obama also tacked to the left on race. In 2012, Trayvon Martin was killed. BLM was founded in 2013. The Ferguson riots followed in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown. The argument was, and was made popular by Ta-Nehisi Coates' bestseller, Between the World and Me, is that police officers, even black police officers, were hunting black males for sport. The acceleration of identity politics would also require an increase in the number of compliance officers who would secure it. In 2016 at Harvard, there were more than 50 Title IX coordinators. There were 30 at Yale. From 2011 to 2015, colleges spent more than $100 million on compliance. From 1997 to 2018, the EEOC handled 1.9 million cases of discrimination. Most importantly, what you find on the left is the argument that open borders ought to be pursued as a form of racial justice. The argument was that colonialism of the West required a remuneration to those who'd been discriminated against, even if they hadn't lived in the United States. The argument was very openly made. There needed to be an importation of millions of illegals, and that politically these groups needed to be represented. California introduced a bill where a third party could cast a ballot for a voter. This is often called ballot harvesting. The greatest threat to the neoliberal oligarchy was the election of Donald Trump that very, very few saw coming. With Trump's victory came what was called the resistance. Those in the bureaucracy openly opposed Donald Trump. There were those in the Pentagon who openly admitted to deceiving Trump as to the number of troops that the United States still had in Syria so that he could not remove them and bring them home. Trump challenged the neoliberal oligarchs on trade, immigration, and war. Those were the three prongs of his platform. From the very beginning of Trump's presidency, there were hoax that circulated. The Steele dossier, which was funded by the Clinton campaign, or the hoax that Russians with $30,000 worth of clickbait had shaped and determined the election. In 2020, the oligarchs had a real problem. And that is, as the economy was booming, things seemed to be doing well, and Trump was scoring very highly in the polls. It looked like Trump would be reelected. In 2020, in part because of Trump's unwitting compliance, what we see is the appeal to those two sources of authority to justify a crackdown on Trump's core constituents. The first is COVID-19, and the second is identity politics. In what the scholar Angelo Codevilla called the COVID coup, the COVID pandemic was used to crack down on many American civil liberties and to destroy the American economy. The claim was to follow the science. But in reality, science itself had become a cartel. It was not the case that researchers would openly challenge the focus of the research. In doing so, they would threaten the billions of dollars that went to researchers, and it would be those in the universities, those scientists and those academics who procured the monies that would be the first to fire those who spoke out against the use of that research. It was also the case that China had become a major component of U.S. Scientific research. Why? Well, because universities could outsource to China. They could engage in very expensive gain-of-function research by hiring Chinese who would take cost-cutting measures. They also welcomed in large numbers of foreign students, particularly the Chinese, who would attend American universities. Ironically, many of those in the media and in politics looked to the Chinese to lead the way on the response to COVID. And so they introduced the mask mandates and the lockdowns that had such a negative impact on the American economy, and particularly on middle-class business. Under the claim of fighting the COVID pandemic, Americans found that all of their key rights came under threat. They found that they had no free association. They were ordered to mask up in their own homes. They weren't allowed to exercise freedom of religion and to attend church. They found they had no freedom of speech. The monopolies that had formed in the media were used to censor those who disagreed with the authorities on COVID, even though many of the things that they said turned out not to be true. For example, the initial predictions as to the number of deaths that would ensue, 2 million in the first year, or the efficacy of masks, or the number of COVID deaths when not distinguishing between those who died solely of COVID or those who were racked by an average of 4 or 5 comorbidities. Also censored were claims that the origin of COVID was gain-of-function research subsidized by the United States government in China. Those claims were called racist, and here we see the conflation of those two new sources of moral authority. On the one hand, it was follow the science, even if it was not empirically based, and on the other hand, it was a claim to anti-racism and identity politics. And so in 2020, during the COVID lockdowns, while Americans are stressed out, they're facing unemployment, losing their jobs, they're masking up, they're isolated, we find the rise of the George Floyd riots. And the death of George Floyd was presented as being part of a greater problem of systemic police racism that was presented as its own pandemic. And so in cities all across America, young radicals and revolutionaries and BLM and Antifa began to burn the great American cities. Very few of them are prosecuted, and they adopted their own anti-white racist speech with attacks on whites and white-owned businesses. Particularly singled out for destruction were all the middle-class businesses. Large corporations owned insurance in places like Minneapolis. But all those middle-class business owners were wiped out. What we find is this bifurcation in the American economy where the 5 large tech companies made all the stock market gains from 2017 to 2020, while Americans were filing for unemployment at record rates. And so COVID was used to assault the bastions of Trump support. Small business owners, Christian churches, many of which were desecrated. Sean King, one of the spokesmen for BLM, advocating the destruction of white Jesus and his white European mother and the desecration of those churches. There was also a full-on assault on police unions. And mayors like Lori Lightfoot would order the Chicago PD to go protect a statue of Christopher Columbus, but not to allow them to use force or to deny them the basic protections that they ought to have in facing a riot. And so Antifa and BLM show up en masse. They surround the cops. They attack them. They throw small explosives at them. And it's to carefully coordinate and to arrange a fight on the part of the leftist revolutionaries with the cops so that they can claim a moral victory. So they show up in large numbers and they're able to fist fight with the police who were ordered to stand down and not use force. This was a moral victory that you could give to the left, the kind of brown shirts on the left. And think about how Antifa in Portland, in which they rioted for 100 days, that those members will pine for the romantic days in which they fought the police. Lori Lightfoot, after the Chicago PD took a beating, then ordered the statue of Christopher Columbus removed. We also saw full corporate cooperation. The NBA, McDonald's, Walmart, in giving large amounts of money to social justice, all the while never attacking the Chinese for oppression in various ways. We found those corporations sponsoring the dismantling of key American statues. The Nancy Pelosi, who argued that the January 6th quote-unquote insurrection was a violation of our temple of democracy, was able to shrug off the tearing down, the toppling of statues to American founders and even abolitionists, so long as they were all white. We saw an increase in the role of United States intelligence agencies. Homeland Security declared that white supremacy was the leading terrorist threat in the United States. One of the key theories to emerge was this little-known figure, a member of the World Economic Forum named Klaus Schwab. He is often compared in his looks and his speech to a James Bond villain. Klaus Schwab argued for a Great Reset. What that meant is all of the neoliberal oligarchs in partnership with identity politics could use COVID-19 to get back on track to globalization and globalism. But what they needed to do was to defeat the populist uprisings that were taking place in Western countries. Moving into the 2020 election, the Democrats would sponsor the most radical platform they had ever sponsored hitherto. They argued for free health care for illegal immigrants, for the naturalization of 22 to 30 million illegals. They argued for dissolving ICE, for defunding the police, ending the Electoral College. They argued for stacking the Supreme Court and for adding new states to the Union. The man that they selected was a man in cognitive decline, and yet they understood that Biden would be more successful with middle-class white voters, those in the blue wall that they had disregarded in the election of 2016. The key decision that secured the election for Joe Biden was the violation of many state laws in providing mail-in ballots were issued out in the millions. And you found very wealthy donors, those like Mark Zuckerberg, who has a 1,600-acre hacienda in Hawaii, for which he thanks the indigenous people, who funded the election and the campaigns in places like Wisconsin in very questionable ways, the Zucker boxes that were set up, and the runners who would run ballots multiple times throughout the day to those boxes. So we concluded this lecture with the Great Awakening, this alliance between a corporate oligarchy and identity politics priesthood that provides legitimacy for those oligarchs. In the next lecture, we'll look at the conservative criticisms of each of those schools of thought and maybe some possible solutions as we move into the future.